with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Matthew. Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer greatly from the elders, the chief priests, and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. Then Peter took Jesus aside and began to rebuke him. God forbid, Lord, no such thing shall ever happen to you. He turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. You are an obstacle to me. You are thinking not as God does, but as human beings do. Then Jesus said to his disciples, Whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever wishes to save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. What profit would there be for one to gain the whole world and forfeit his life? Or what can one give in exchange for his life? For the Son of Man will come with his angels in his Father's glory, and then he will repay all according to his conduct. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Good afternoon. It is good for us to be here. Happy Labor Day weekend. Labor Day weekend is a return to reality. It brings to mind my experiences some 40 years ago when I used to teach 7th grade. And one of the last things I would ask the kids to do on the last day of school or so was to write a little essay. What did they plan to do during the summer? And I'll never forget one essay that I read. It was written by Betsy Nelson. This happened years ago, but I never forgot it. And she made one of the most profound statements that I have never forgotten. She said, "The only thing bad about summer is when it's over." And Betsy made a lot of sense. And then she began to describe how she planned to spend the summer swimming, bike riding with her friends, and having fun. The end of summer reality has set in. It's a time for us to think about how we live our lives, our choices, and our relationships. I invite you to reflect on the prayer over the gifts that Father Bill will say at the beginning of the consecration at Mass today. It will be, May this sacred offering, O Lord, confer on us always the blessing of salvation, that what it celebrates in mystery, it may accomplish in power. We are called to make our salvation known and accomplish its power by carrying out the blessing of salvation in how we are living. We make our faith known by our actions. In the Chicago Catholic a few weeks ago, Cardinal Blaise Supich wrote, "Faith is about the Lord's presence." I like to think about faith as the way we live our lives. So when you put the two together, the way we live should reflect the Lord's presence. In the second reading we heard today, St. Paul talks about our lives as being a living sacrifice. In the gospel we heard, Jesus gives us the command to take up our crosses and follow him. We think about our willingness to give up our will as one way to follow Jesus. We have the freedom to choose. We can think about freedom as being able to do whatever we want. St. Pope John Paul II puts freedom into the perspective of the challenges posed by St. Paul and Jesus when he wrote, "True freedom is not the ability to do whatever we want, but the ability to do what we ought." This freedom makes us morally responsible for our actions. Our actions have moral value depending on our choices. Each of us make decisions on how we will use our freedom. The choice to live the way God says that we ought to live is not easy. In the first reading, we heard how the prophet Jeremiah struggled as an outcast as he remained committed to following the ways of God. All the day I am an object of laughter. Everyone mocks me, Jeremiah wrote. We are called to examine our relationships. St. Paul advises us in the second reading. Do not conform yourselves to this age, but be transformed by the renewal of your mind, that you may discern what is the will of God, what is good and pleasing and perfect. Do not conform yourselves to this age. This is a powerful message for living a life of faith, especially at this time of new beginnings. The kids are back in school now. Many times what happens to them is greatly influenced by who they hang around with. Our young people need to examine their relationships. Are their relationships helping to do the will of God, doing what is good, pleasing, and perfect? We as adults are also called to examine our relationships. Do our relationships help us to do what is good, pleasing, and perfect? Each of us must decide how to use our freedom. Do we serve the Lord? Do we serve our own desires? Or do we just conform to the desires of others? Again, having taught school so many years ago, I remember one of my students named Nancy in 7th grade. At the beginning of the school year, Nancy was fine. Then I started to notice a big change. Nancy became quite a challenge and a behavior problem. I noticed that she started to hang around with 3 other girls in the class who, shall we say, knew more than their prayers. I had a conference with Nancy and her parents, and Nancy said about her friends, "They like me better when I'm bad." Her parents and I convinced her to stay away from the other 3 girls. It wasn't easy for her. In the last place I worked, I experienced the most negative, malicious, vicious gossip in a workplace I ever saw. They tried to get me roped in on it too, and I always would respond, I never say anything about anybody unless they're here to defend themselves. Well, I found myself a lone wolf there for a time until I was able to associate with people there who didn't gripe, complain, or gossip. Resisting evil, doing the will of God, doing what is good, pleasing, and perfect, doing what we ought, can involve suffering. In the gospel, Jesus mentions that whoever wishes to come after me must deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. There is no doubt that abuse and unkindness of others can cause us to suffer. The kind of suffering Jesus is talking about that we as his disciples must be willing to embrace comes as a direct result of following his manner of life and his mission. Suffering that comes from abuse and injustice should be resisted and eliminated as much as possible, just as Jesus did throughout his ministry. Denial of self is not like giving up chocolate for Lent, or not giving into the action of gossiping about others, or resisting doing things that aren't good just to get approval from other people. Rather, taking up the cross refers to our choice to lose ourselves entirely in Christ, to take on Christ as a way of life and mission, his very identity as our own. This is a big challenge, especially in our modern world, the way we live. Here are some suggestions I read about that might help us to make this a reality. Do not worry about what other people think. We have nothing to prove to them. We need to stay on our own path. We will experience problems and failures, but remember they are not permanent. Don't give up. We need to accept our reality. Defeats, our humanity rather. Defeats can make us wiser and better people. Don't blindly follow the advice of others, especially what we find on social media. Don't focus on reputation. Instead, focus on character. Think about how Jesus felt about the Pharisees. He criticized them because they were leaders, but their hearts were corrupt. He called them hypocrites because their main focus was on their reputation, their acts, their outward appearance. Instead, think about who Jesus partnered with. He sought out ordinary people living ordinary lives, just like us. Jesus partners with us to give our hearts to him and showcase his power. As Father Bill raises ourselves up in prayer, we remember the blessing of salvation we celebrate here will give us the power to accomplish salvation in our lives. May God continue to bless us.